Football didn't begin with plans, diagrams, or systems. It began as instinct. 22 players chasing space, chasing the ball, chasing something they hadn't yet learned to name. There were no tactical revolutions back then, only movement, intuition, and chaos. But slowly, quietly, the game began to think. Each generation left behind a question, and the next one tried to answer it. Why do we lose control in midfield? Why does space disappear? Why does this team dominate possession while that one dominates results? Tactics didn't evolve out of theory, they evolved out of necessity. Every system was born because the previous one stopped working. This is the story of how football learned to organize itself, how it learned to defend space, to control tempo, to value structure, and how, along the way, it traded chaos for clarity. This isn't a story about formations. It's a story about ideas, about how the game learned to solve problems, and how every solution created a new one. So tonight, we're not rushing through history. We're drifting through it, from chaos to control, from freedom to structure, from instinct to intelligence. This is the evolution of football tactics, a story the game has been telling itself for over a century. Take a breath and let it unfold. Chapter 1. The chaotic beginnings. In its earliest form, football had no intention of being organized. There were no tactical boards, no shapes drilled on training pitches, no discussions about compactness, spacing, or control. There was only instinct. Early football was defined by numbers that now feel almost impossible to imagine. 2 defenders, 5 forwards, entire teams stretched across the pitch, chasing the ball wherever it moved. Formations like the 2-3-5 weren't strategic decisions. They were reflections of a game still learning what it was. The priority was simple: score more goals than the other team. Balance was secondary, defending almost accidental. Matches were chaotic, open, and unpredictable. Space existed everywhere because no one knew how to manage it yet. Players followed the ball rather than positions. If the ball drifted left, bodies followed. If it moved forward, lines collapsed into motion. This wasn't ignorance. It was innocence. Football, at this stage, didn't need structure because it hadn't yet encountered its own limitations. Fitness levels were lower, the pace was slower. Pressing didn't exist because recovery wasn't expected. Goals were frequent, matches were wild, and the crowd came not for control but for spectacle. But even in chaos, patterns began to form. As teams played more matches, they started to notice familiar problems: conceding too easily, being overrun when possession was lost, losing shape without understanding why. Slowly, questions began to surface. What happens when everyone attacks? Who protects space when the ball is lost? How do you stop chasing shadows? Football didn't ask these questions out of philosophy. It asked them out of frustration, and once those questions existed, the game could no longer remain innocent. The chaotic beginnings were beautiful, but they were unsustainable, and without realizing it, football was already taking its first steps toward structure. Not because it wanted to change, but because it had to. In the next chapter, the game begins to organize itself, to assign responsibility, to give shape to chaos. This is where tactics truly begin. Chapter 2. Once football began asking questions, it could no longer remain chaotic. The problem was no longer effort or passion, it was balance. Teams were scoring freely, but conceding just as easily. Matches were entertaining, but unreliable. Winning felt closer to chance than design. And so, slowly, football began to organize itself. The first real shift came not from a desire to control games, but from a need to stop losing them. In the early 20th century, managers and thinkers started to realize something fundamental. Space mattered. If attackers could be delayed instead of chased, if defenders could hold zones instead of following individuals, the game could be shaped rather than survived. One man, more than any other, formalized this idea: Herbert Chapman. Chapman didn't see football as 11 individuals reacting to chaos. He saw it as a system, one that could be arranged, balanced, and taught. His solution was the WM formation. For the first time, players were given clearly defined responsibilities. Defenders defended. Midfielders connected play. Forwards attacked with structure rather than instinct. The pitch began to divide itself into zones. Lines formed. Distances mattered. This was a quiet revolution. Football didn't suddenly become rigid or mechanical, but it became intentional. Instead of everyone moving toward the ball, players began to hold their positions, trusting that structure itself could solve problems. The introduction of shape changed how teams thought about risk. Attacking was no longer constant, it became selective. Defending was no longer reactive, it became anticipatory. Most importantly, football began to understand that control didn't always come from possession. Sometimes it came from organization. Matches slowed slightly, scores became tighter, but consistency emerged. The game was learning discipline, and with discipline came a new tension between freedom and responsibility. Players could no longer roam endlessly. They had roles to respect, spaces to protect, teammates to balance. This wasn't the death of creativity, but it was its first negotiation. Football had discovered shape, and once shape existed, it could be refined, challenged, and eventually reimagined. The foundations were laid. In the chapters that follow, these early structures will be tested, stretched to their limits by thinkers who believe organization should enable freedom, not restrict it. This is where football begins to dream again. Chapter 3. Total football and controlled freedom. Once football learned how to organize itself, a new question emerged. What if structure didn't limit freedom, but enabled it? For decades, tactics had focused on balance. Players stayed in lanes, roles were fixed. Responsibility came before expression, but in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a different philosophy began to take shape, one that didn't reject structure, but reimagined it. This was total football. Popularized by Ajax and the Netherlands, total football was not a formation as much as a way of thinking. The idea was simple but radical. Any player could occupy any space as long as the structure remained intact. Positions became flexible. Movement became constant. Intelligence replaced rigidity. If a fullback pushed forward, someone else filled the space. If a midfielder drifted wide, the system adjusted around him. The team moved as one organism, shifting, rotating, breathing together. This wasn't chaos returning. It was chaos with memory. At the heart of total football was trust. Trust in teammates, trust in understanding, trust that freedom could exist inside a shared framework. Players were no longer defined by numbers on their backs. They were defined by awareness. The pitch became elastic. Space was no longer something you reacted to. It was something you created. Johann Cruyff embodied this philosophy, not just in how he played, but in how he saw the game. He wasn't the fastest, he wasn't the strongest, but he understood space before others even noticed it existed. Total football shifted the focus from individual duels to collective intelligence. Winning wasn't about overpowering opponents. It was about outthinking them. But freedom, even when organized, comes with risk. Total football demanded extraordinary fitness, concentration, and technical ability. One lapse in awareness could unravel the entire system. And while it dazzled, it wasn't always practical in every context. As football spread globally, not every team could afford such fluidity. Not every squad could train the same way. Not every league allowed the same space, and so, once again, the game adapted. Total football didn't disappear. It left an imprint. It proved that structure and creativity were not enemies. That intelligence could be as powerful as strength. That freedom could exist if it was shared. In the next chapter, football responds to this freedom, not by copying it, but by trying to contain it. This is where control turns defensive. Chapter 4. Defensive organization and the need for control. Every tactical idea eventually meets resistance. Total football expanded space, blurred roles, and demanded constant intelligence. And for a while, it felt like the game had unlocked something close to freedom. But football is not sentimental. It adapts. As teams struggled to cope with fluid movement and positional interchange, a quieter philosophy began to take hold, one built not on expression, but on survival. If freedom created problems, then limitation had to become the answer. This was the moment football turned inward. Defensive organization wasn't born out of negativity. It was born out of necessity. Italian football, more than anywhere else, understood this instinctively. The leagues were tighter, the margins smaller, mistakes more expensive. Systems like Catenaccio were not about refusing to play. They were about refusing to collapse. Instead of chasing the ball endlessly, teams learned to protect space. Instead of stepping out aggressively, defenders learned to wait. Compactness replaced chaos. For the first time, football accepted a difficult truth. You don't need the ball to control a game. Control could come from denial, from patience, from forcing opponents into areas where their freedom slowly disappeared. Defenders stopped following men and began guarding zones. Midfields dropped deeper. Lines moved closer together. Space, once abundant, became rare. Matches grew quieter, not slower in effort, but slower in opportunity. Every attack had to work harder for less reward. This era changed how football thought about intelligence. Reading danger became more important than reacting to it. Anticipation replaced aggression. Discipline became a skill in itself. But with this new control came tension. Creative players found themselves crowded out. Time on the ball vanished. Moments of improvisation felt dangerous rather than welcome. The game had become safer, but also narrower. This wasn't a rejection of beauty, it was a recalibration of risk. Football, having flirted with freedom, was now learning restraint, and restraint reshaped everything. Defenders became organizers. Holding midfielders became anchors. Structure mattered more than flair. The pitch shrank psychologically, even if its dimensions stayed the same. What once felt like open fields now felt like corridors. And yet, this era was essential. Without defensive organization, football would never learn balance. Without compactness, it would never learn efficiency. Without limitation, creativity would never be forced to evolve. This period taught the game that chaos, left unchecked, collapses, that freedom without structure eventually eats itself. But it also revealed a new problem. As football mastered how to defend space, it risked forgetting how to use it. The challenge was no longer survival, it was synthesis. How do you control games without suffocating them? How do you protect structure while still allowing expression? The answer would not come from the back line alone. It would come from the center of the pitch, from players tasked not just with defending or attacking, but with managing rhythm. The next evolution belonged to the midfield, and with it, football would search once again for balance. Chapter 5. The midfield era. Once football learned how to defend space, a new question emerged. If control could be achieved without the ball, could it be perfected with it? The answer lived in the center of the pitch. As defensive organization tightened games and reduced freedom, football began to realize that the midfield was no longer just a link between defense and attack. it was the game itself. This was the beginning of the midfield era. Formations like the 4-4-2 didn't dominate because they were elegant. They dominated because they were balanced, two banks of four. Clear responsibilities, defined distances. The midfield became a place of order rather than invention. Work rate mattered more than flair. Discipline mattered more than risk. Midfielders were no longer encouraged to roam freely. They were expected to hold shape, cover ground, and protect structure. This was football becoming practical. The romantic image of the lone playmaker drifting through space began to fade. In its place came pairs, partnerships, systems built on symmetry. The rise of the box-to-box midfielder symbolized this shift. These players weren't defined by moments. They were defined by consistency. They pressed, recovered, supported, and recycled possession. They ran not toward glory, but toward balance. Games were won not by brilliance alone, but by control over 90 minutes. Midfield battles became wars of attrition. Territory was gained inch by inch. Mistakes were punished ruthlessly. In this era, football began to value reliability. The best midfielders weren't always the most gifted. They were the ones you could trust. Trust to track runners. Trust to hold their position. Trust to keep the team intact. This shift changed the rhythm of matches. Instead of moments of chaos followed by recovery, games settled into patterns. Possession was recycled. Attacks were built patiently. Defensive shape was never abandoned recklessly. Football learned to breathe, but something else happened too. Creativity didn't disappear. It was redistributed. Instead of one player controlling tempo, the responsibility was shared. Instead of expression through improvisation, creativity emerged through coordination. Teams began to move as units rather than collections of individuals. This era produced midfielders who understood the game spatially rather than emotionally. They sensed danger before it arrived. They closed passing lanes instead of chasing tackles. They controlled games by being where the ball would go next. Football had become quieter, but smarter. Yet even this balance had limits. As teams mastered midfield control, matches risked becoming predictable. When both sides prioritized shape, risk evaporated. The game began to feel contained. Pressing was conservative. Possession was safe. Transitions were cautious. Football had learned how not to lose, but it hadn't yet learned how to overwhelm. And in that tension between control and dominance, a new idea began to take shape. What if control wasn't just about balance? What if it could be used aggressively? What if organization could suffocate opponents rather than merely contain them? The next evolution wouldn't come from holding space. It would come from attacking it. Pressing would no longer be reactive. It would become proactive. The midfield era laid the foundation, but the game was about to speed up again. In the next chapter, football stops waiting. It starts hunting. Chapter 6. Pressing, intensity, and the modern athlete. Once football learned how to control the midfield, it faced a new dilemma. Control alone was no longer enough. If teams could hold shape, recycle possession, and avoid mistakes, then how did you force an advantage? How did you move beyond balance and impose yourself? The answer was not patience. It was pressure. This was the moment football stopped waiting for mistakes and began to create them. Pressing had existed in fragments before, but now it became deliberate, organized, relentless. Arrigo Sacchi's AC Milan offered one of the clearest early blueprints. The idea was simple but demanding. Defend as a unit, press as a unit, move as one line. The pitch shrank vertically. Distances between players tightened. Time on the ball vanished. Football accelerated. Players were no longer judged only on technique or intelligence, but on endurance. The modern athlete emerged, faster, fitter, more disciplined. Pressing wasn't just about winning the ball back. It was about controlling space without possession, about dictating where opponents could breathe and where they couldn't. Forwards became defenders. Midfielders became hunters. Defensive lines stepped higher, compressing the game into smaller and smaller zones. This evolution changed the emotional texture of football. Matches felt more urgent. Moments arrived faster. Errors were punished instantly. There was no time to settle, no room to pause. Every touch carried consequence. Fitness became tactical. Teams trained not just to run, but to run together. Pressing triggers were rehearsed. Angles were calculated. Chaos was manufactured deliberately. Football, once a game of patience, now demanded constant attention. This intensity redefined roles across the pitch. Strikers were judged on their work rate as much as their goals. Midfielders had to cover ground endlessly. Defenders were expected to defend high up the pitch, exposed and alert. The margins became brutal. One missed press could unravel an entire system. One late step could open a corridor of space. And yet, for all its aggression, pressing was still about control. It was an extension of the same idea football had been chasing for decades: limit space, limit time, limit freedom. The difference was tempo. Where previous eras slowed the game to protect structure, this one sped it up to overwhelm opponents. But intensity has a cost. As pressing systems spread across Europe, players were asked to give more, physically, mentally, emotionally. Seasons grew longer, schedules became relentless. Burnout crept in quietly. The modern game demanded perfection, repeatedly, without rest. Still, pressing reshaped football irrevocably. It taught the game that dominance didn't require possession, that control could be aggressive, that organization could suffocate as effectively as it could stabilize. But even this evolution would reach its limits. When every team presses, advantage disappears again. When intensity becomes universal, it loses its edge. Football, once more, would adapt. The next step would not be faster, it would be smarter. In the next chapter, control shifts from pressure to patience, from running without the ball to protecting it. This is where possession becomes power. Chapter 7. Possession as control. After years of intensity, football began to feel its own exhaustion. Pressing had compressed space, accelerated tempo, and demanded constant physical output. Matches were faster, louder, more relentless, but somewhere within that noise, a quieter idea began to resurface. What if control didn't come from chasing the ball, but from never giving it away? This was the return of possession, not as decoration, but as authority. At the center of this shift was a philosophy that treated the ball as protection. If you had it, the opponent couldn't hurt you. If you moved it well enough, they would eventually break. Pep Guardiola didn't invent possession football, but he refined it into something precise, repeatable, and dominant. In his teams, possession wasn't about flair, it was about positioning. Players weren't told where to run, they were told where to stand. The pitch was divided into zones. Spacing became sacred. Angles mattered more than speed. The ball moved not to entertain, but to destabilize. This version of football was patient to the point of provocation. Passes recycled, attacks reset, opponents chased shadows. Where pressing suffocated space through effort, possession suffocated it through logic. Time slowed again. Matches felt calmer, but more suffocating. Opponents ran more, but touched the ball less. Energy was drained not by tackles, but by waiting. Possession football redefined intelligence. Decision-making mattered more than athleticism. Awareness replaced urgency. Mistakes weren't forced, they were invited. This philosophy reshaped every position. Goalkeepers became playmakers. Center backs split wide. Fullbacks stepped into midfield. Midfielders rotated constantly, offering passing lanes rather than runs. Even forwards were reimagined. Strikers weren't judged solely on goals, but on how they connected play. Wingers held width not to attack, but to stretch defensive lines. Every movement had purpose. Every pass was part of a larger pattern. Football had become rehearsed, but not rigid. Critics called it sterile, too safe, too controlled, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Possession football didn't overwhelm through speed or strength. It overwhelmed through inevitability. Opponents knew what was coming. They just couldn't stop it. And yet, this dominance came with a new tension. When possession becomes absolute, risk disappears. When structure becomes perfect, spontaneity struggles to breathe. Moments of improvisation felt out of place, even dangerous. Players who thrived on instinct had to learn restraint. Creativity was no longer about expression, it was about timing. The game had become cerebral. This era produced some of the most technically gifted teams football had ever seen. But it also raised a quiet question. Had football solved itself too completely? When control is total, unpredictability fades. When patterns are perfected, surprise becomes rare. Possession had mastered the game's logic. But logic alone cannot sustain emotion forever. Still, its legacy was profound. Possession football taught the game how to dominate without rushing, how to suffocate without fouling, how to win without chaos. It proved that intelligence could be a weapon, that patience could be aggressive, that control didn't have to look forceful to be absolute. But as always, dominance invites resistance. Opponents would find new ways to disrupt rhythm, to exploit transitions, to weaponize moments of loss. The next evolution wouldn't reject possession, it would fragment it. Roles would blur, positions would dissolve. Control would be shared, flexible, adaptive. Football was about to become hybrid. Chapter 8. Data, systems, and rehearsed football. Once possession became control, football entered a new phase, not louder, not faster, but more precise. This was the era where intuition gave way to information. Data had always existed in football, passes completed, goals scored, minutes played, but now it became central to decision-making. Every movement could be measured, every action evaluated, every pattern mapped. Football began to see itself through numbers. Teams no longer relied solely on instinct or tradition. They relied on evidence. Where does danger usually emerge? Which passes break lines most effectively? How many sprints can a player sustain before performance drops? Answers replaced guesses. Tactics became less about inspiration and more about optimization. Training sessions changed. Players rehearsed movements repeatedly, not because they lacked creativity, but because repetition reduced risk. Patterns were drilled, pressing triggers refined, passing sequences automated. The game became choreographed. From the outside, this football could feel predictable. Build-up phases looked familiar. Attacks unfolded in recognizable shapes. But predictability did not mean simplicity. Behind every movement sat layers of preparation. Coaches anticipated responses before opponents even reacted. The margins grew thinner. One missed cue, one delayed run, one mistimed press. At this level, football was less about invention and more about execution. This evolution reshaped how players were judged. Creativity was no longer free form, it was contextual. Risk-taking had to be justified. Improvisation needed purpose. The most valued players were not always the most expressive, but the most reliable. Football rewarded consistency. Teams became machines not because they lacked emotion, but because efficiency demanded it. Yet this era also introduced a quiet unease. When systems are perfected, individuality struggles to surface. When patterns dominate, surprise becomes rare. Supporters sensed it. Matches were controlled, but sometimes emotionally distant. Beautiful in their logic, but restrained in feeling. The game was smarter than ever, but also more contained. Still, this phase was unavoidable. Modern football operates under relentless pressure from schedules, finances, expectations. Data provided stability, systems offered protection. They allowed teams to survive an unforgiving environment. But football has never been static. As systems spread, opponents adapted. As patterns repeated, they were studied. As control became universal, it lost its edge. The question resurfaced once again. How do you find advantage when everyone knows the answers? The solution wouldn't come from rejecting structure. It would come from blending it, from breaking roles without breaking systems, from flexibility without chaos. Football was about to blur its own boundaries. In the next chapter, positions dissolve, responsibilities overlap, and the game becomes fluid once more. This is the age of hybrids. Chapter 9. Hybrids and positionless football. As football absorbed data, systems, and structure, a quiet contradiction emerged. The game had never been more organized, yet players were becoming harder to define. Positions, once rigid and reliable, began to blur. This was not a return to chaos. It was a refinement. Football didn't abandon structure. It learned how to bend it. The modern game no longer asked players to stay in one place. It asked them to solve problems as they appeared. Fullbacks drifted into midfield. Wingers tucked inside. Midfielders dropped between center backs. Roles overlapped. Responsibilities layered. The pitch became fluid again, but intelligently so. This was positionless football, not in the sense that positions disappeared, but in the sense that they became starting points rather than destinations. Players were judged less by where they stood, and more by how they interpreted space. The rise of the inverted fullback symbolized this shift. Once tasked with hugging the touchline and defending wide areas, fullbacks now stepped into central zones, offering numerical superiority, controlling tempo, and linking play. Midfielders became multifunctional. They defended, progressed the ball, supported attacks, and recovered shape, often within the same passage of play. Even center backs were no longer confined to defense. They carried the ball forward. They broke lines with passes. They participated in build-up as active creators rather than passive anchors. Football had become layered. This evolution demanded a new kind of intelligence. Players needed spatial awareness, technical comfort, and tactical discipline, all at once. The modern footballer wasn't defined by flair alone or by work rate alone, but by adaptability. Those who couldn't adjust were left behind. Those who could became indispensable. But this fluidity came with tension. When everyone can do everything, identity becomes harder to grasp. Supporters struggled to describe roles that no longer fit familiar language. Commentary leaned on new terms: hybrids, profiles, interior roles. Football had become concept heavy, yet beneath the complexity, the goal remained the same: control space, limit risk, create advantage. Positionless football wasn't about freedom for its own sake. It was about flexibility as protection. If opponents adapted, the system adjusted. If space closed, roles shifted. This made teams harder to predict, but also harder to emotionally latch onto. There were fewer archetypes, fewer easily recognizable figures. The classic number 10 faded, the traditional winger evolved, the pure striker adapted or disappeared. Football had become efficient and elusive, and yet something familiar lingered beneath the surface. This wasn't a rejection of the game's past. It was an echo of it. Total football had asked players to interchange within a system. Modern hybrids did the same, just with far greater precision. The difference was control. Where earlier eras trusted instinct, this one trusted preparation. The game had come full circle, but with memory. Still, as roles blurred and systems tightened, football faced one final question. What had all this evolution cost? What was gained through control, and what quietly slipped away? To answer that, the game had to look backward and forward at the same time. In the next chapter, football pauses to reflect, not on tactics alone, but on feeling, on what was lost and what was gained. Chapter 10. After more than a century of evolution, football arrived at a strange moment. The game had never been smarter, never more organized, never more precise, and yet something felt different. Not worse, not better, just changed. To understand that change, football had to look at itself honestly. What did it lose along the way? And what did it gain in return? In the earliest eras, football was unpredictable by nature. Space existed because no one knew how to manage it. Moments happened because structure hadn't learned how to prevent them. That unpredictability gave birth to magic. Players paused on the ball. They improvised. They took risks without consequence. As tactics evolved, those pauses disappeared. Space shrank, time vanished. Every action was measured against outcome. The game lost stillness. It lost moments where players could simply think. It lost the luxury of waiting. Individual brilliance didn't disappear, but it became conditional. Creativity now had to serve the system. Improvisation needed justification. The game became less forgiving. Mistakes were punished instantly. Freedom became expensive. But football also gained something profound. It gained fairness. Matches were no longer decided solely by chaos or chance. Preparation mattered. Intelligence mattered. Underdogs could compete through organization. Smaller teams could survive through structure. Football became more democratic. It also gained longevity. Modern players could extend careers through positioning and understanding rather than pure athleticism. Teams could sustain dominance without exhausting themselves emotionally. The game learned how to protect itself. Tactical evolution reduced reliance on individual heroics. It shifted emphasis from moments to movements, from stars to systems. This didn't kill emotion. It redistributed it. Emotion moved from isolated acts to collective patterns, from solo runs to coordinated press, from individual duels to shared dominance. But emotion expressed through systems is quieter. It demands patience from the viewer, understanding rather than instinct. And not everyone wanted that. Football had become something you watched closely, not something that immediately overwhelmed you. This tension defines the modern experience. The game is richer intellectually, but thinner emotionally, more consistent, but less surprising, safer, but more distant. And yet, these losses were inseparable from the gains. You cannot have freedom without risk. You cannot have structure without sacrifice. You cannot have control without limitation. Football didn't choose one path over another. It negotiated between them. Every era solved a problem and created a new one. What we lost was innocence. What we gained was understanding. And understanding, once earned, cannot be undone. The question is no longer whether football was better before. It's whether we're willing to appreciate what it has become. In the final chapter, the game looks forward, not with certainty, but with curiosity. Because evolution never ends, it only pauses, long enough to ask what comes next. Chapter 11. The future of football tactics. After more than a century of evolution, football finds itself in a familiar position. It has solved many of its problems, and in doing so, it has created new ones. The modern game is structured, optimized, and intensely studied. Every space is mapped, every movement analyzed, every decision measured against data. So, where does football go from here? The future of tactics is unlikely to be defined by one revolutionary idea. There will be no single system that changes everything overnight. Instead, evolution will continue quietly, through refinement rather than reinvention. Youth football already offers clues. Players are being trained to understand multiple roles from an early age. They learn spatial awareness before specialization. Adaptability is valued as much as talent. Rather than producing pure positions, academies are producing interpreters, players who can read the game and adjust within it. Technology will play a growing role. Data analysis will become faster, more precise, more predictive. Artificial intelligence will identify patterns invisible to the human eye. Opposition tendencies will be mapped before matches begin. Preparation will deepen. But football's history suggests something important. As control increases, resistance emerges. When systems become too dominant, players find new ways to disrupt them. When space disappears, imagination searches for it. Creativity doesn't vanish, it relocates. It appears in smaller moments, quicker decisions, subtler movements. The next generation of tactical evolution may not look dramatic. It may look quiet, a disguised pass, a positional rotation timed perfectly, a pause in the middle of intensity. Football will continue to oscillate between freedom and structure, between instinct and organization. No era ever truly replaces the one before it. It absorbs it. Total football still lives inside positional play. Defensive organization still underpins pressing. Possession still shapes hybrid systems. The future will not reject the past. It will layer it, and perhaps over time the game will soften again. Space may return in new forms. Risk may be reintroduced carefully. Moments may grow again from patterns. Football has always been a conversation between eras, each one responding, adapting, learning. The game doesn't move forward in straight lines. It moves in cycles, and as long as football continues to learn, to adjust, to question itself, its evolution will never truly end. In the final moments, we don't need to predict what football becomes. We only need to understand what it's always been, a living language spoken differently by every generation, but never finished. The managers who changed how football thinks. Football tactics do not evolve on their own. They are shaped by people who see the game differently and are willing to impose that vision. While players execute ideas, it is managers who define systems, organize space, and decide how teams behave without the ball. Across history, a small number of coaches didn't just win trophies, they changed how football was played everywhere else. This is the story of those figures and the tactical shifts they introduced. Herbert Chapman. Football learns structure. The first true tactical architect of football was Herbert Chapman. Before Chapman, football formations were loose and reactive. Teams attacked in numbers and defended instinctively. The offside law change in 1925 forced football to confront a new reality. Attackers now had more space behind defensive lines. Chapman responded by creating the WM formation. This system reorganized teams into clearer lines: 3 defenders, 2 midfielders, and a structured attacking shape. For the first time, players had defined positional responsibilities. Chapman introduced organized defensive lines, positional discipline, tactical planning before matches. His ideas transformed football from instinctive movement into organized structure. Every tactical system that followed traces its roots back to this moment. Rinus Michels, Total Football in Practice. If Chapman taught football structure, Rinus Michels taught it flexibility. At Ajax and with the Netherlands, Michels implemented total football, a system built on positional interchange and collective intelligence. Players were trained to understand space rather than positions. Key principles included constant movement, pressing high up the pitch, Interchangeable roles. Total football required high technical ability and fitness, but it introduced a revolutionary idea. Structure could enable freedom. Rather than fixing players to zones, Michaels taught them how to rotate while maintaining team shape. This philosophy influenced generations of coaches and remains foundational to modern positional play. Arrigo Sacchi, defending space, not players. Arrigo Sacchi changed how football defended. At AC Milan, Sacchi introduced a zonal system that prioritized compactness, synchronized movement, and pressing triggers. His teams defended high, moved as a unit, and prioritized spatial control over individual duels. Sacchi's Milan demonstrated high defensive lines, zonal marking over man marking, collective pressing. Defending became proactive rather than reactive. Teams stopped chasing attackers and started controlling areas of the pitch. Sacchi's influence reshaped modern defending and laid the groundwork for pressing systems used today. Johann Cruyff, tactics become identity. Johann Cruyff transformed tactics into philosophy. At Barcelona, Cruyff implemented positional play not as a temporary system, but as a long-term identity. His teams focused on ball circulation, spatial occupation, and technical superiority. Cruyff introduced positional play principles. Youth development aligned with first-team tactics. Possession as a means of control. Barcelona's academy was restructured to produce players who understood the system intuitively. Tactics were no longer isolated to the first team. They became cultural. This approach ensured continuity across generations and established Barcelona as a reference point for possession football. Pep Guardiola, positional play perfected. Pep Guardiola refined Cruyff's ideas into a highly precise tactical model. At Barcelona, Bayern Munich, and Manchester City, Guardiola focused on controlling space through ball possession and positional discipline. His teams prioritized spacing, overloads, and structured build-up play. Key tactical elements included inverted fullbacks, zonal occupation, overloads in central areas, ball retention as defensive protection. Guardiola's teams suffocated opponents by denying them possession and forcing constant defensive repositioning. His influence spread across Europe, shaping how modern teams build attacks. Jose Mourinho, control without possession. Jose Mourinho challenged the dominance of possession-based football. Rather than contesting control through the ball, Mourinho's teams focused on compact defending, structured transitions, and game management. His approach prioritized results over aesthetics. Mourinho emphasized defensive compactness, low blocks and counterattacks, tactical discipline. His success demonstrated that tactical effectiveness does not require possession dominance. Mourinho's influence remains visible in teams that prioritize structure and efficiency. Jürgen Klopp, gegenpressing and transition control. Jürgen Klopp redefined pressing as an attacking tool. His concept of gegenpressing treated ball recovery as the most effective moment to attack. Instead of retreating after losing possession, teams immediately pressed to win the ball back in dangerous areas. Klopp's systems focused on high-intensity pressing, vertical attacks, transition dominance. This approach reintroduced chaos into a controlled game, but it was organized chaos. Klopp's influence reshaped how teams think about transitions and attacking momentum. The lasting impact. Each of these managers solved a specific problem posed by the era before them. Chapman introduced structure. Michaels introduced flexibility. Sacchi introduced collective defending. Cruyff introduced identity. Guardiola introduced precision. Mourinho introduced pragmatism. Klopp introduced transition dominance. Together, they form a continuous tactical conversation. Football does not evolve randomly. It evolves because someone sees a problem and answers it. This lineage defines the modern game. And in the chapters that follow, we see how these ideas merge, overlap, and reshape football once again. The evolution of formations. Football did not begin with structure. It discovered it slowly through repetition, failure, and adaptation. In the earliest days of the sport, formations were not tactical tools. They were reflections of instinct. Teams attacked in numbers because defending was secondary, scoring goals was the priority, and balance was something football had yet to understand. The earliest widely used formation, the 2-3-5, perfectly captured this mindset. Two defenders stayed back almost by necessity. Three midfielders existed mainly to shuttle the ball forward. Five attackers pushed high, often in straight lines. This was football as momentum rather than organization. Matches were open, chaotic, and high-scoring. Space existed everywhere because no one knew how to manage it. Players followed the ball rather than holding positions, and defensive responsibility was loosely defined. But as the game grew more competitive, the limitations of this approach became obvious. Teams conceded too easily. Leads were fragile. Matches were unpredictable in ways that frustrated coaches and players alike. The first major structural shift came not from philosophy but from regulation. In 1925, the offside law changed, reducing the number of defenders required between an attacker and the goal from 3 to 2. This single adjustment altered the geometry of football overnight. Attackers suddenly had more space behind defensive lines. Goals increased sharply. Defenses struggled to cope. In response, managers began to rethink positioning. The most influential response came from Herbert Chapman, who introduced the WM formation. The WM reorganized the pitch into clearer lines, 3 defenders, 2 midfielders, and a structured attacking shape. For the first time, football embraced the idea of positional responsibility. Players were assigned zones rather than simply chasing the ball. Defensive shape became deliberate. Midfielders were tasked with connecting play rather than merely supporting attacks. This shift marked the moment football formations became tools rather than habits. As decades passed, formations continued to evolve in response to tactical problems. In the 1950s, Brazilian teams introduced the 4-2-4, a system that balanced defensive stability with attacking width. 2 central midfielders protected the defense while allowing 4 attackers to stretch the pitch. The 4-2-4 reflected a growing understanding of spacing. Width became a weapon. Fullbacks began to contribute more actively, while midfielders assumed greater responsibility for defensive transitions. From this system emerged one of football's most enduring shapes, the 4-4-2. By the 1960s and 1970s, the 4-4-2 became the dominant formation across Europe. Its appeal lay in its simplicity. 2 banks of 4 created natural defensive balance. 2 strikers offered direct attacking options. Responsibilities were clear and easily understood. The 4-4-2 did not demand exceptional technical ability or tactical complexity. It thrived on organization, work rate, and discipline. For decades, it defined how football looked, particularly in England. But no formation remains dominant forever. As pressing and midfield congestion increased, the limitations of the 4-4-2 became apparent. Teams struggled to control central areas against systems that overloaded midfield. In response, formations adapted again. The 3-5-2 emerged as a solution, offering numerical superiority in midfield while retaining defensive cover. Wingbacks replaced traditional wide midfielders, providing width while allowing central areas to remain compact. This system required high physical output and tactical intelligence, particularly from wingbacks tasked with covering entire flanks. At the same time, the 4-3-3 gained prominence, especially in leagues prioritizing possession and pressing. 3 midfielders allowed teams to control tempo, press higher, and dominate central zones. The 4-3-3 proved flexible. It could morph into defensive shapes when needed or expand during attacks. It became the foundation for many modern systems. As football entered the 21st century, formations became increasingly fluid. Coaches stopped treating formations as rigid blueprints and began using them as reference points. The starting shape mattered less than how teams behaved in different phases of play. Modern teams often defend in one shape and attack in another. Fullbacks invert into midfield. Wingers drift centrally. Midfielders drop into defensive lines. The concept of a fixed formation began to dissolve. Instead, football adopted functional shapes, formations that change depending on possession, pressure, and opponent behavior. This evolution reflects a deeper understanding of the game. Formations are no longer about where players stand. They are about how teams manage space. The journey from 2-3-5 to modern hybrids tells the story of football learning restraint, balance, and control. Every new formation emerged because the previous one left gaps, physical, tactical, or psychological. Football did not abandon its past. It absorbed it. Each formation remains a chapter in an ongoing conversation, one that continues to shape how the game is played today. No single rule has shaped football more than offside. Not formations, not pressing, not even tactics themselves. The offside rule is the invisible hand behind almost every tactical evolution the sport has undergone. It determines space, timing, defensive height, and attacking movement. Without it, modern football simply wouldn't exist. In football's earliest years, there was no meaningful offside rule at all. Players could stand permanently next to the opposition goal, waiting for the ball. Matches were chaotic, congested, and heavily skewed toward opportunism rather than skill. Long balls and goal hanging dominated. Structure was impossible because space had no boundaries. To restore order, football borrowed from rugby. Early versions of the offside law were extremely strict. Any attacker ahead of the ball was considered offside. This forced teams to advance together and encouraged short passing, but it also stifled attacking play. Goals were rare, movement was cautious, matches lacked fluidity. The sport needed balance. By the late 19th century, football adopted the three-man offside rule. An attacker needed three opposing players between himself and the goal to be considered onside. This opened space slightly and allowed attackers to time runs rather than remain static. For decades, this rule shaped football's geometry. Defensive lines dropped deep. Midfields stretched vertically. Attackers relied on dribbling and combination play rather than runs in behind. But the game still lacked speed and verticality. Everything changed in 1925. The offside law was amended so that only two opposing players, usually the goalkeeper and one defender, were required to keep an attacker onside. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Goals per game surged almost overnight. Defensive structures collapsed. Space behind defensive lines suddenly mattered. This single rule change forced football to reinvent itself. Defenders could no longer sit deep and wait. Attackers now had incentive to make diagonal runs, to exploit space rather than crowd it. Timing replaced positioning. Movement became as important as technique. Crucially, this rule change created modern defensive shape. Herbert Chapman's WM formation was a direct response to the new offside law. By dropping a center half deeper, teams could re-establish numerical balance and protect space behind the defense. From this moment on, football tactics became reactive to offside interpretation. As the decades passed, the rule remained structurally the same, but interpretation evolved. And interpretation matters as much as wording. In the mid-20th century, offside was judged strictly. Any part of the body beyond the defender resulted in an infringement. Linesmen were encouraged to flag early. Attacking movement was conservative. By the late 20th century, football began favoring attacking play. Officials were instructed to give attackers the benefit of the doubt. Level is onside became common guidance. This encouraged riskier runs, higher defensive lines, and faster transitions. This shift directly enabled pressing football. Teams could push higher without fear of being punished constantly by long balls. Compactness increased, midfields compressed, the pitch effectively shrank. The offside trap emerged as a weapon. Italian teams in particular mastered coordinated defensive movement, stepping forward as a unit to catch attackers offside. Defending became proactive rather than reactive. But the offside rule's influence didn't stop there. As attacking movement grew more complex, so did debates around interfering with play. Could a player be offside without touching the ball? What if they blocked a defender's line of sight? What if they made a run but never received a pass? These questions led to increasingly nuanced interpretations. By the 2000s, offside was no longer binary. It became contextual. Officials judged intent, impact, and involvement, not just position. This complexity reached its peak with the introduction of VAR. Video review brought precision, but also controversy. Marginal decisions, toes, shoulders, armpits, became decisive. Offside moved from human judgment to technological measurement. The rule itself hadn't changed, but its emotional impact had. Where offside once felt like part of the flow of the game, it now felt clinical, dissected, frozen, analyzed frame by frame. Tactically, however, VAR reinforced high defensive lines. Teams could trust technology to catch marginal offsides, allowing defenders to push even higher. Pressing systems became more aggressive. Space compressed further. Modern football is played in smaller spaces than ever before, largely because offside enforcement allows it. Today, offside governs everything: how high teams defend, how attackers curve runs, how midfielders time passes, how fullbacks step up, how goalkeepers position themselves. It is the rule that defines distance. Without offside, there is no gegenpressing, no high line, no compact block, no modern tactical structure. Football's tactical history is, in many ways, the history of teams trying to exploit or survive the offside rule. And as technology continues to refine its enforcement, the rule will keep shaping the game's future, just as it has shaped its past. Why pressing became non-negotiable. For most of football's history, defending was passive. Teams retreated into shape. They waited. They absorbed pressure and reacted. Pressing existed, but it was selective, a burst, not a philosophy. Winning the ball high up the pitch was seen as risky rather than strategic. That approach no longer survives in modern football. Today, pressing is not optional. It is structural. Teams that cannot press effectively struggle to control games, protect leads, or even compete at the highest level. The rise of pressing was not ideological. It was practical. As football became faster and more technical, space became the most valuable resource on the pitch. Teams that allowed opponents time on the ball were punished. Defenders became better passers. Goalkeepers became distributors. Build-up play moved deeper. If you didn't apply pressure early, you invited danger. The first major shift came with collective pressing, not individual chasing. Rather than one forward closing down aimlessly, teams began moving as units. Passing lanes were blocked, triggers were identified, pressing became coordinated. Arrigo Sacchi's AC Milan in the late 1980s demonstrated this clearly. His team pressed as a block, defended high, and compressed space vertically. Defending was no longer about retreating, it was about controlling territory. This changed how teams thought about defense. Pressing was no longer just about winning the ball. It was about dictating where the opponent could play. As fitness levels improved in the 1990s and early 2000s, pressing became more sustainable. Players could repeat high-intensity actions. Compactness became possible over longer periods. The game accelerated. By the late 2000s, pressing had evolved again. The rise of possession-dominant teams forced defenders to rethink risk. Allowing opponents to circulate the ball comfortably meant chasing shadows. Pressing became the solution. The breakthrough came with counter-pressing. Rather than retreating after losing possession, teams immediately attempted to win the ball back. The logic was simple. Opponents are most vulnerable immediately after gaining possession, before structure is restored. Jurgen Klopp popularized this concept at Borussia Dortmund. His teams pressed aggressively, vertically, and relentlessly. Pressing was no longer a defensive phase, it was an attacking weapon. Winning the ball high led to shorter attacks, fewer passes before shooting, disorganized defenses. This reduced reliance on creative playmakers. Chances were manufactured through chaos rather than construction. As data began influencing coaching, pressing gained further legitimacy. Metrics showed that high turnovers led to higher quality chances. Expected goals models confirmed what coaches suspected. Pressing efficiently was more effective than defending deep. Pressing also reduced defensive exposure. By compressing the pitch, teams shortened recovery runs. Defensive lines stayed high. Midfielders remained close to defenders. The game became denser. This density made it harder for opponents to exploit space. Crucially, pressing became necessary because opponents improved technically. Modern center backs are comfortable on the ball. Goalkeepers initiate build-up. If left unpressured, teams can progress cleanly through thirds. Without pressing, passive defending collapses. This forced even traditionally defensive teams to adapt. Sitting back became dangerous. Blocks were pushed higher. Pressing triggers were drilled. Today, pressing determines tactical viability. Teams that press poorly face immediate consequences. They lose territory. They concede possession. They invite pressure. They struggle to transition. Even teams that prefer deeper blocks must press situationally. Pressing has become a baseline skill, not a stylistic choice. The evolution also changed player profiles. Forwards are now defenders. Midfielders must sprint repeatedly. Wingers track fullbacks relentlessly. Pressing is collective. One player failing breaks the system. This increased the importance of coaching. Pressing systems require structure, communication, and repetition. It is no longer instinctive, it is engineered. The margin for error is small. When pressing fails, teams are exposed. High defensive lines mean space behind. Recovery speed and coordination are critical. This risk-reward balance defines modern football. Despite its physical demands, pressing persists because the alternative is worse. To not press is to surrender control. Modern football punishes hesitation. Time on the ball equals danger. Pressing compresses time, space, and options. It forces mistakes. It dictates rhythm. It imposes identity. Pressing didn't become dominant because it was fashionable. It became unavoidable because the game evolved beyond passive defense. At the highest level, pressing is no longer a tactical preference. It is the entry requirement. The decline of the traditional number 10. For decades, the number 10 was football's gravitational center. They didn't just play the game, they interpreted it. They slowed it down, sped it up, and decided matches with a single touch. The traditional number 10 operated between the lines, free from strict defensive duties. They were playmakers in the purest sense, vision over volume, intuition over structure. Football was once built to accommodate them. Formations like the 4-4-2 diamond, 4-2-3-1, and earlier variations of the WM left deliberate space behind the forwards. Defensive lines sat deeper, midfields were less compact. The space between lines existed, and number 10s lived there. Players like Diego Maradona, Zinedine Zidane, Juan Román Riquelme, Francesco Totti, Rui Costa, and later Mesut Ozil thrived because the game allowed them time. Time to receive, time to turn, time to choose. That time no longer exists. The decline of the traditional number 10 was not sudden. It was gradual, structural, and unavoidable. As pressing intensified, the space between midfield and defense shrank. Teams defended higher and more compactly. Midfield lines moved closer to back lines. Passing lanes disappeared. The pocket, the number 10's natural habitat, collapsed. At the same time, football's physical demands increased. Players were expected to contribute defensively, press aggressively, and recover quickly in transition. The traditional number 10 often exempt from defensive duties, became a liability. Coaches began asking difficult questions. Can we afford a player who doesn't press? Can we protect them defensively? Can we build a system around one free role? Increasingly, the answer was no. This shift coincided with the rise of positional play. Rather than relying on individual creativity in central pockets, teams began creating chances through structure. Width, overloads, rotations, and spacing replaced improvisation. Creativity became distributed. Instead of one player creating everything, multiple players contributed. Fullbacks provided width. Midfielders progressed the ball. Wingers attacked half spaces. Forwards dropped deep to link play. The responsibilities of the number 10 were absorbed by the collective. This change was reinforced tactically. The 4-3-3 reduced reliance on a central playmaker. Three midfielders shared control. One held, one progressed, one connected play. The false nine further blurred the role. Rather than a static creator, forwards dropped into midfield zones, dragging defenders and opening space for others. Lionel Messi's evolution exemplified this shift. While often labeled a number 10, his role was fluid, part forward, part midfielder, part creator. He didn't wait for space, he created it through movement. Traditional number 10s waited. Modern creators move. Defensively, teams became ruthless. Midfield pressing traps targeted the central zones. Opponents actively hunted playmakers. Space between lines became the most contested area on the pitch. Surviving there required constant movement, physical resilience, and defensive awareness. Few traditional number 10s fit this profile. As analytics entered the game, inefficiencies were exposed. Data showed that teams pressing collectively and maintaining compactness conceded fewer high-quality chances. Systems that relied on one creative hub were easier to neutralize. The game favored repeatable patterns over moments of genius. This didn't eliminate creativity, it redistributed it. Modern football still values vision and technique, but it demands them within structure. Players like Kevin De Bruyne, Bernardo Silva, and Luka Modric operate creatively while fulfilling defensive and positional responsibilities. They are not free roles, they are multifunctional. The traditional number 10, static, central, defensively light, struggled to adapt. At youth level, development pathways changed. Young players were no longer trained as specialists. They learned multiple roles. Coaches prioritized versatility, pressing intelligence, and positional awareness. The archetype of the pure number 10 faded. Today, teams rarely build systems around a single playmaker. Even when a creative player exists, their freedom is conditional, earned through work without the ball. The number 10 didn't disappear because football rejected creativity. It disappeared because football demanded more running, more structure, more responsibility. The game moved from individual interpretation to collective orchestration. The decline of the traditional number 10 marks one of football's most significant tactical shifts. Not the loss of artistry, but the transformation of how creativity survives in a faster, tighter, more demanding game. Why goalkeepers became playmakers. For most of football's history, goalkeepers had a single responsibility: stop the ball from going in the net. Distribution was secondary. Comfort on the ball was optional. Decision-making ended at the edge of the penalty area. A goalkeeper's value was measured in saves, not passes. That definition no longer applies. In modern football, goalkeepers are not just the final line of defense, they are the first point of attack. Their ability with the ball now shapes how teams build play, resist pressure, and control territory. This transformation was driven by necessity, not innovation. As pressing became more aggressive, teams began defending higher up the pitch. Forwards no longer waited passively. They hunted center backs and blocked passing lanes. Build-up play became risky. Defenders under pressure needed an outlet. The goalkeeper became that outlet. But this only worked if the goalkeeper could play. Early attempts were cautious. Goalkeepers recycled possession, played short passes, and stayed within safe zones. But as systems evolved, so did expectations. The back pass rule accelerated everything. Introduced in 1992, it prevented goalkeepers from picking up deliberate back passes. Suddenly, keepers were forced to use their feet under pressure. This rule change did not immediately create playmakers, but it planted the seed. Goalkeepers could no longer be passive recipients. They had to participate. As tactical sophistication increased, managers realized something critical. A goalkeeper comfortable with the ball could create a numerical advantage. When a goalkeeper steps into build-up play, the team effectively plays with an extra outfield player. Pressing systems that rely on man marking or numerical equality break down. This forced opponents to make choices. Press the goalkeeper and leave space elsewhere. Sit off and allow progression. Either option benefits the team in possession. The rise of positional play amplified this effect. Managers like Pep Guardiola integrated goalkeepers into structured build-up patterns. Keepers were asked to play through pressure, switch play accurately, recognize pressing triggers, position themselves high to support circulation. The goalkeeper became a pivot. This also changed defensive structure. High defensive lines require coverage behind. Goalkeepers began acting as sweepers, intercepting through balls and managing space outside the box. This dual responsibility, distributor and last defender, reshaped the position. Manuel Neuer became the archetype. At Bayern Munich, Neuer combined elite shot stopping with proactive positioning and fearless distribution. He played outside his box, broke up counterattacks, and initiated attacks with precision. This wasn't stylistic flair, it was tactical necessity. As teams compressed space, long balls became ineffective. Controlled build-up reduced turnovers and sustained pressure. Goalkeepers who could play short passes accurately enabled this control. Statistics reinforced the trend. Data showed that teams building from the back retained possession longer and conceded fewer high-quality chances. Goalkeepers with high pass completion and progressive distribution correlated with territorial dominance. Recruitment changed accordingly. Clubs began prioritizing first touch, passing range, composure under pressure, decision-making. Shot stopping remained essential, but it was no longer enough. Youth development followed. Young goalkeepers are now trained like outfield players. They practice rondos, positional games, and build-up patterns. Their education begins with the ball at their feet. The role's mental demands also increased. Goalkeepers must read pressing structures, recognize triggers, and choose between short, medium, and long distribution, often under extreme pressure. A single mistake is visible and costly. This pressure filters out those unable to adapt. Modern pressing systems rely on forcing errors. A goalkeeper unable to distribute becomes the weakest link. Opponents exploit it relentlessly. This made the evolution unavoidable. Even traditionally defensive teams now require competent ball-playing goalkeepers. Sitting deep still demands distribution to escape pressure and relieve territory. The goalkeeper's role has expanded from reaction to initiation. They now influence tempo, spacing, pressing resistance, defensive depth, transition control. Football's transformation into a space-dominated, press-driven game demanded a goalkeeper who could think, move, and pass like an outfield player. The position didn't change for aesthetic reasons. It changed because the modern game would not function without it. The most tactically iconic teams in football history. Some teams don't just win trophies, they change how the game is understood. Their influence extends beyond results into coaching manuals, youth academies, and tactical language itself. These teams become reference points, studied long after the players have retired. They are not remembered because they were unbeatable. They are remembered because they redefined football's possibilities. One of the earliest examples came from the Hungarian national team of the 1950s. Known as the mighty Magyars, Hungary dismantled rigid positional structures. Forwards dropped deep, midfielders surged forward, defenders stepped into build-up play. Their most radical innovation was the withdrawn center forward, a role that confused defenders and disrupted man-marking systems. This idea would later resurface as the false nine. Hungary didn't win the World Cup, but they shattered tactical assumptions across Europe. In the 1970s, Ajax and the Netherlands took those ideas further. Total football wasn't a formation, it was a philosophy of movement. Players rotated constantly, positions were interchangeable. The team pressed high, defended collectively, and attacked as a unit. This system demanded extreme tactical intelligence and technical quality. It prioritized space over position and coordination over individuality. Ajax's dominance wasn't just about trophies, it established principles that still underpin modern football. Those principles reached their most complete expression decades later in Pep Guardiola's Barcelona. Between 2008 and 2012, Barcelona produced one of the most influential tactical teams in history. Their core ideas were simple in theory, difficult in execution: positional discipline, constant passing triangles, controlled pressing, extreme compactness. Barcelona defended by keeping the ball. Their press began the moment possession was lost. Defensive lines pushed high. Space was compressed relentlessly. Lionel Messi's role as a false nine destabilized defensive structures across Europe. Fullbacks provided width. Midfielders controlled tempo. This team didn't just dominate matches, it reshaped coaching ideology worldwide. Youth academies adopted positional play. Coaches rethought pressing. Possession became synonymous with control. In Germany, a different interpretation emerged. Jurgen Klopp's Borussia Dortmund and later Liverpool introduced high-intensity pressing as a primary attacking weapon. Rather than controlling games through possession, these teams controlled moments, counter-pressing forced turnovers. Attacks were vertical, fast, and ruthless. Klopp's teams demonstrated that pressing could be systematic, sustainable, and decisive, not chaotic. This influenced the Premier League deeply, accelerating the pace and physical demands of English football. Italy contributed its own iconic tactical teams. Arrigo Sacchi's AC Milan in the late 1980s revolutionized defensive organization. High lines, zonal marking, and coordinated pressing replaced deep reactive defending. Sacchi proved that defensive discipline could be proactive and aggressive. His Milan side defended higher than most teams dared at the time, using compactness rather than retreat. The legacy of this approach remains foundational in modern defensive systems. Spain's national team from 2008 to 2012 adapted Barcelona's principles at international level. Their dominance came not from athletic superiority, but from spatial control, short passing, patient circulation, and relentless pressing suffocated opponents. This period redefined international football, proving that club-level tactical sophistication could translate onto the global stage. Other teams left quieter but lasting impacts. AC Milan's Christmas tree formation, Chelsea under Mourinho, Bayern Munich's high-pressing machines, Manchester City's positional rotations. Each contributed ideas that became standard practice. What unites these teams isn't style, but influence. They forced others to adapt. They changed how opponents prepared. They rewrote tactical expectations. Iconic teams are not just successful, they are instructional. They provide blueprints. Football evolves through these reference points. Each generation borrows, adapts, and reacts to the teams that came before. Today's tactics are a layered history of these sides, their successes, their flaws, their innovations. The most tactically iconic teams didn't end debates. They started them, and in doing so, they shaped the modern game. For much of football's history, training was fragmented. Fitness was trained separately from tactics. Technique was drilled in isolation. Match preparation was often limited to walkthroughs and verbal instruction. Players ran laps. They completed passing drills. They played short-sighted games with little connection to the tactical model they would execute on match day. This approach produced fit footballers, but not synchronized teams. As football accelerated, this disconnect became a problem. Modern football demanded players who could press collectively, move in compact units, transition instantly between phases, maintain structure under fatigue. Traditional training methods could not replicate these demands. The solution emerged not through new formations, but through a new way of training football itself. This was the beginning of tactical periodization. What football training used to look like. Historically, training followed a simple logic. Early week, fitness. Midweek, technical work. Late week, tactical preparation. Each element was treated as separate. Fitness coaches focused on endurance and strength. Technical coaches worked on ball skills. Managers explained tactics on a board. The assumption was that these pieces would combine naturally on match day. They didn't. Players might be fit but poorly positioned. Technically sound but tactically disconnected. Prepared individually but not collectively. As matches became faster and more structured, these gaps were exposed. The problem modern football created. By the late 20th century, football had changed fundamentally. Pressing systems compressed space, defensive lines pushed higher, midfields became crowded. Players had less time to think and more decisions to make per second. Crucially, decision-making under fatigue became decisive. Training that did not replicate match intensity failed to prepare players for real situations. Teams needed players who could execute tactics instinctively, not consciously. This required a complete rethink. The origins of tactical periodization. Tactical periodization was developed primarily in Portugal, most notably by Vitor Frade. Rather than treating fitness, technique, and tactics as separate elements, Frade proposed a radical idea. Everything should be trained through the tactical model. In this framework, there is no isolated fitness training. Every drill reflects match reality. Every session reinforces how the team wants to play. Fitness emerges from tactical execution. Technique develops within tactical context. Decision-making is trained constantly. The aim was not to teach tactics intellectually, but to embed them physically. How tactical periodization works. At its core, tactical periodization is built around the match day. Training weeks are structured in cycles, each session carefully calibrated for intensity, complexity, tactical focus. Rather than generic drills, sessions replicate specific moments, pressing triggers, build-up patterns, defensive shifts, transition scenarios. Players repeatedly experience the same situations they will face in matches. Over time, movements become automatic. The team no longer thinks about positioning, it reacts as a unit. This repetition is deliberate. Players don't improvise systems, they internalize them. Why it changed football. The impact was immediate and visible. Teams trained under tactical periodization moved more compactly, pressed more synchronously, transitioned faster, maintained shape under pressure. Matches looked different. Players appeared coached. Defensive lines stepped together. Midfield units shifted as one. The gap between training ground and stadium disappeared. Football became less chaotic and more controlled. Managers who adopted it. The most prominent early adopter was José Mourinho. At Porto, Mourinho used tactical periodization to create a team that was tactically disciplined, physically resilient, psychologically prepared. His teams didn't rely on constant pressing or possession dominance. They relied on structural clarity. Every player knew where to be, when to move, how to respond to transitions. As Mourinho moved to Chelsea, Inter, and Real Madrid, these ideas followed. Other managers adapted the model. Pep Guardiola incorporated tactical periodization within positional play. Diego Simeone used it to reinforce compactness and defensive cohesion. Jurgen Klopp blended it with intensity-based pressing models, different styles, same foundation. Training mirrored match reality. The impact on players. Tactical periodization changed what was demanded from players. Players now had to process information faster, recognize patterns instinctively, execute movements repeatedly under pressure. Tactical intelligence became as important as technical skill. The margin for improvisation shrank. This produced players who were disciplined, positionally aware, reliable within systems. But it also reduced freedom. Creativity didn't disappear, it became contextual. Players could express themselves within structure, not outside it. The game never stops evolving. Football has never evolved through theory alone. It evolves through problems. Every tactical shift in the game's history has emerged as a response to something that stopped working, a weakness exposed, a pattern solved, a dominant idea neutralized. When one system succeeds, it invites imitation. When it spreads, it loses its edge. And when it loses its edge, the game moves on. This cycle has defined football from the very beginning. The earliest formations prioritized attack because defending was unstructured. When goals became too easy, teams added defenders. When defending became too rigid, attackers adapted. When space disappeared centrally, teams went wide. When width was neutralized, systems inverted. Each solution created a new problem. The WM formation responded to changes in the offside rule. The 4-4-2 restored balance and clarity. Midfield triangles emerged to control space. Pressing intensified to limit time on the ball. Fullbacks moved inside to overload central areas. Goalkeepers stepped forward to resist pressure. None of these ideas existed in isolation. They were reactions. Dominant eras accelerate this process. When a team imposes itself decisively, it forces the rest of the football world to respond. Pep Guardiola's Barcelona compressed space so effectively that pressing became essential. Jurgen Klopp's pressing machines forced teams to improve build-up play. Manchester City's positional rotations pushed defenders into midfield roles. Each breakthrough shortens the lifespan of tactical advantages. Where systems once lasted decades, they now last seasons. This is partly due to modern infrastructure. Coaches travel globally. Analysis is instant. Footage is accessible. Ideas spread quickly. A tactical edge in one league becomes common knowledge across Europe within months. What was innovative last season becomes expected the next. This has led to a form of tactical convergence. Across leagues, teams now defend compactly, press in coordinated blocks, build from the back. Value positional discipline. Differences remain, but they are increasingly subtle. The margins are found in details rather than shape. Structure has become universal. This does not mean football has stopped evolving. It means evolution has accelerated. The game continues to change through law adjustments, physical development, training methodology, data analysis, youth education. Each shift alters the balance of space and time, the two constants that govern football tactics. Space is always being reduced. Time is always being contested. As players become faster and more technically secure, systems must adapt. As athletes cover ground more efficiently, structure becomes tighter. As recovery improves, intensity increases. The game recalibrates continuously. No formation, system, or ideology has ever permanently solved football. Every dominant approach contains the seeds of its own decline. Once opponents learn where the space is, the advantage disappears. This is why football remains endlessly adaptable. It resists final answers. Tactics are not endpoints, they are conversations. Each era speaks to the last, correcting its excesses and exposing its blind spots. Modern football may appear more organized, more rehearsed, and more uniform than ever before, but beneath that structure, the same process continues. Problems emerge, solutions are tested, advantages fade, and the game moves again. Football has never stopped evolving, and it never will. Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Pitch. If you stayed until the end, I appreciate you taking the time to sit with this story and with the game we all love. Football keeps changing, but the memories, the patterns, and the moments we carry with us tend to stay. Wherever you're listening from, I hope this helped you slow things down, even just a little. I'll see you in the next one.